Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello, my guest is John Huddleston. He is a board-certified Master Arborist with the International Society of Arboriculture. He's a registered consulting arborist with the American Society of Consulting Arborists. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
You have just taken me on a tour here in the San Jacinto Mountains of one property, looking at the trees and telling me which has a problem and which doesn't. Let's begin with the oak. What kind of beetle is infesting this San Jacinto Mountain forest?
It's actually a problem that's all over Southern California right now and spreading upwards. There's an invasive beetle called the gold-spotted oak borer. It's a close relative to a really well-known beetle back east called the emerald ash borer that's just destroying ash populations all over the country. But this, which is a cousin, like I said, they're both agrylus beetles. It's an invasive beetle that was brought over across the desert. There's a little bit of contention whether it was Arizona or Mexico that this beetle came from, but nevertheless, brought over a desert in somebody's camping firewood where it found a new food source, and its populations just went out of control because it doesn't have any natural predators or other checks to its population. Again, it's called the gold-spotted oak borer. It attacks both the iconic coastal live oaks up and down the coast of California, as well as the black oaks in the mountains of California. Black oaks are actually the most common species of oak in the mountains throughout California, and so it really is a big deal. As they move sort of unchecked through the wilderness, these beetles are doing a massive amount of damage to the old growth trees. They don't tend to get into trees that are smaller than 6 inches in diameter, but certainly everything older than that, they're destroying.
You also pointed out that there's a beetle problem for the pine trees.
Yeah, the beetle problem for the pine trees locally is it's less of a problem than a situation. The pine beetles are endemic. They're here naturally. They've been here as long as the pine trees have. And they're more of a symptom of the drought itself, of trees just not having enough resources to survive. Part of that's due to climate change, but part of it's just a good old-fashioned drought and sandy, decomposed granite soils.
I noticed that you didn't point out any problem with the cedars. Are they stronger and sturdier?
It's not that the wood itself is stronger or sturdier. It is somewhat resistant to insects and decay fungi, though. Part of what kills the pines so quickly when bark beetles attack is they bring in several different species of fungus that clogs up the vascular system of the trees while they're inside feeding. The cedars are not susceptible to the same type of diseases, and they don't have the same type of pests. Cedars have aphids and scale insects, things that sort of snack on the leaves, but nothing that goes directly after the vascular system, like the gold-spotted oak borer and the pine bark beetles.
On the drier part of the property is rather gravelly, but the manzanitas seem to love that. And this is a tree that has beautiful red bark, but I've noticed over the years that you can just cut off the dead branches and the tree does fine. Is that true?
Manzanitas are actually really finicky. They have a special relationship with mycorrhizae and the different organisms in their soil, so they don't really deal with a whole lot of extra attention very well. They don't like to be supplementally irrigated. They don't like to have their mulch raked up around them, and they really don't like to be pruned in my experience. But certainly there's exceptions to every rule.
We're here in the San Bernardino National Forest. The trees are basically the natural native trees of this area. Is there a problem when somebody brings in some tree that doesn't belong up here traditionally?
There's been a big push lately towards planting only native species in different areas. I don't actually subscribe with that group of people, and it may be just due to my undereducation on the subject. I know that there's some concern that planting non-native species encourages wildlife to feed in other places, and it discourages the natural order of things. I don't know that I've seen that so much in my experience, but I know that the people that are passionate about it are very passionate about it. So that's probably something I could stand to learn more about.
We're 1 mile high at 5,000 feet, but you go down into Riverside County and the surrounding areas in the lowlands. There, so many people have planted different trees that aren't native to the Southern California natural vegetation. Are there special problems with those trees?
As trees and plants and people and animals and every living thing gets sort of moved around the world, globalization has an effect. Sometimes when trees are brought to different neighborhoods, they bring pests along with them. But for the most part, Southern California is largely a desert scape, naturally. So there's not going to be a whole lot of variety in the amount of plantings you'd be able to do for a native landscape, I think, in these areas. To realistically want the same type of people that live in California now to want to stay in California in that native landscape, I mean, they never would have changed it to begin with, I suppose.
You're an arborist, which I think of as a person focusing on trees. What about the bushes and the other plants? I know when I go hiking here, sometimes I see a lot of beautiful flowers. I see sagebrush. I see all sorts of other smaller plants, not trees. Do we have to worry about them?
Well, arboriculture does focus on trees and shrubs, woody plants, and vines. That's definitely where the breadth of my knowledge is. But I do know that we have to worry about moving around plants and animals and fungus and all kinds of different things. There's just so much we don't understand about our impact, the impact of globalization, I should say. So I would say definitely people need to be concerned about moving around seeds even, or pollen or spores. That's how these things get spread around. In New Zealand, actually, to enter the airports, you have to clean off your shoes entirely because of the possibility of bringing in a small seed that would end up being invasive and taking over their environment.
I remember that happening to me coming back from the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. The Department of Agriculture wanted to clean my shoes, and I've said, well, that's a great way to get them clean, just telling me where you've been. I've also seen signs up here in Idlewild in the mountain community not to bring up cut wood. Is that really a problem?
That's actually how we got the gold-spotted oak borer up here to begin with, and how San Diego got it from across the desert to begin with, is people transporting firewood. What people don't understand a lot of times is what creates firewood is a dead tree. And oftentimes what killed that tree can be moved along with that firewood, whether it's a disease or an insect or both. So really what the Department of Agriculture is trying to do, what CAL FIRE is trying to do, what a lot of different government entities are trying to do is cut down on the movement of these firewood and other green waste that spreads around these problems. Even worse than the gold-spotted oak borer is a bug that's being moved around on firewood and different types of green waste right now. One of two bugs, actually. As a pair, they're known as the invasive shot-hole borers. They're especially important here in Southern California. They infest over 300 different species of trees, and the number keeps going up all the time. Different trees that they're willing to sort of hitch a ride on. So with the gold-spotted oak borer, it's predictable enough. You can say, don't move oak. With the invasive shot-hole borers, the Corotio shot-hole borer and the Polyphagus shot-hole borer, with those species of beetles, it's impossible to know which type of wood they're going to be traveling on, and that's really potentially very scary set of insects there. So yeah, moving firewood is very, very bad globally and locally.
Even if the firewood has been sitting for years, wouldn't the insects disappear?
Over a year would probably be safe, but the problem is when you start making concessions, when you start saying, well, this is safe and that isn't safe, and this is safe and that isn't safe, you're assuming that people have that attention span and that they're going to remember all the little rules. And what ends up happening more than not is that people start bending the concessions and making them more appropriate to their situation, and then firewood gets moved. So rather than looking at the exceptions to the rule, it's better to just really focus on that rule itself and say, don't move firewood.
You are a board-certified master arborist with the International Society of Arboriculture. Do you have to pass a different kind of test for different regions? Internationally, there are totally different kinds of trees all over the world. Do arborists specialize? Or do they have to know about all the trees on the planet, which I think is up in the millions?
Arborists are absolutely regional. There's some knowledge that's more or less universal, but arborists are regional for the most part. That's not to say that we don't have to know about diseases and insects that come from different regions. We're constantly having to update our education through continuing educational units to find out what's coming down the pipe next. The only reason why we knew about the gold-spotted oak borer is because somebody else was studying it and shared that knowledge. And that's also the reason why I know about the invasive shot-hole borers now is because I continue to do the seminars and the continuing education. But no, I don't need to know about every insect all the way around the world. But I don't get calls from all the way around the world. But I need to know certainly more than just tree insects, though. As a board-certified master arborist, I need to know about all the relevant diseases, insects, temperatures, soil types, structural hazards and defects, different types of decay organisms and fungi. There's so many different things that an arborist needs to know to be effective at their job. A regular certified arborist has to pass what I would call a fairly simple test. The difference between that exam and the board-certified master arborist exam is like night and day, though. The board-certified master arborist exam is the most difficult exam I've ever taken.
You were willing to not take a job when I offered to have you cut down a dead tree because you said there's a government program that will pay 80% of it. And that, of course, would be a big savings for me. What is that program?
That particular tree, that was the one that was infested with gold-spotted oak borer. There's a CAL FIRE, there's a joint program going on with CAL FIRE and the County of Riverside right now, which is where we're at. And CAL FIRE, of course, would be the California Department of Fire, but the state fire. But there's a program going on between those two right now to help reimburse homeowners for the cost of getting rid of this invasive insect. There are also other programs that, through different agencies, different grant money was allocated to help people for fire hazards too. So we looked at some dead pine trees. Even though they're not infested with an invasive insect, there are different government agencies that help to pay for that removal. There are also some situations in which, especially up here in the mountains, where the trees are tall enough that they pose a threat to the power lines that supply the community. So if those trees pose a significant threat to those power lines, then the power company will pay for the removal of those trees. So there's always, or not always, but oftentimes there are assistance programs in place to help homeowners deal with it. Tree removal can be extremely expensive, and it might be prohibitively expensive for certain people to even live up in this community if they were responsible for the removal of all of these trees when disaster strikes.
In the city, most people just hire their gardeners or their gardeners' friends to do the tree cutting. And sometimes I see these trees just cut awfully badly. They look horrible. They just sort of chop them. Is that because they aren't trained to really trim and cut a tree in a more artistic way?
I don't know that the artistic really is the right word. It's not really what we're going for is the artistry of the cut. It's the structural stability of the finished product and also the longevity of the life form. That's arboriculture focuses on tree care based on trees biology. So it's actually plant health care. Typically, your typical gardener or typical handyman isn't educated in tree biology, so would have no idea the after effects of the cuts that they make. The problem with expecting all trees to be pruned properly, though, is there are so many trees. The people that end up wanting to do that hard labor, because tree work is hard labor, people that end up wanting to do that hard labor don't tend to be the same people that want to spend a lot of time in a classroom. And so the demand far exceeds the supply, I would say, for arboriculture.
How does caring for a tree increase its value?
A lot of people don't really know or understand how much trees are actually worth. A tree that only has as small as a 4-inch diameter, if it has a nice structure and has been well taken care of, it can be worth up to $10,000. And a lot of people don't know that. They hire people that are underqualified, thinking that it doesn't really matter, it's just a tree, when in fact they have a very valuable possible investment in their front yard. If you hire someone who's qualified, someone that understands tree biology and understands how trees are appraised and their value, then every time they come to your property is going to be worth more money. If you hire somebody that doesn't understand the tree's biology and doesn't understand how to prune it in a way to enhance its value, your tree's going to be worth less money, your property's going to be worth less money, and eventually you're probably going to have some structural issues. Instead of having a value, they could represent a cost. You may have to pay for that tree to be removed.
Indeed, trees have a monetary value, but let's talk briefly about the value to the ecosystem. Trees are home and food to so many other species.
Not to mention the carbon sequestration. That's been a big topic lately in terms of sustainability and in terms of reversing some of the damage, the man-made damage to the environment that we've done. Part of what builds a tree's structure are carbon molecules. And where those carbon molecules are largely come from is right out of the air through photosynthesis. So that's a really, really important part of what trees do for the planet is sequestering that carbon out of the air. Another thing that they do, they create oxygen, obviously, for breathing, and they cool the environment around them too. The more trees you have, the cooler your area is. Not just because of the shade, but because of the way that they volatilize the water that's in the ground. Through the way that they breathe and transpire and cool themselves down, they cool down the environment around them.
How important are trees to global warming and climate change?
There are a lot of people, a lot of very well-informed scientists out there right now that think that trees may be the only solution to climate change. Massive, massive planting of trees and reforestation will, in a sense, reverse all the things that we've done. And part of that is the carbon sequestration, and part of that is just that cooling effect that I mentioned earlier.
Why did you get fascinated by trees as opposed to some animal?
I really like being high up in the air. And so I was originally drawn to climbing trees. As a child, I was always up in a tree. As soon as we moved up to the mountains, I was in the top of the tall trees here. And then once I found out I could make some money climbing trees, I started doing tree removal up here, which takes a certain breed of person. Not everybody wants to get 120 feet up in the air and with a chainsaw and remove a tree. But I felt pretty at home there. And then it was just a natural progression to want to learn more about the trees that I was climbing. And so I became an arborist and then a board certified master arborist.
I want to thank you so very much for educating me about how to care for our trees, what to look for, what needs to be done. Thank you very much for being my guest.
Thanks for having me.
I have been speaking with John Huddleston, who is a registered consulting arborist with the American Society of Consulting Arborists. We'll be back in a moment with more ecological issues.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Perlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
My guest is Susan Moss. She is an artist who has works with 540 collectors, including 5 museums, and has done an eco-series dealing with climate change and other related environmental issues. She is also an author of many books, including Keep Your Breath, Survive Cancer, The Accident Stager, and her most recent book, COVID-19, A Natural Approach. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on, Nancy.
You have written a fascinating book that gives a lot of background about COVID, about what kind of precautions we should take. You've even included a lot of information about food and herbs that might be useful to us in keeping us healthy, including recipes. Let's begin with this horrible pandemic that we're in and how you are approaching the COVID-19.
Yes, it's very terrible. This virus was apparently engineered in a lab in Wuhan, China, and it was developed with taxpayer U.S. money, is my opinion, to develop vaccines, which will make a lot of money for the government. But they didn't know what they were doing. They used gain of function on an ordinary coronavirus and made it so that it was more infectious and more virulent. So when it was released accidentally or accidentally on purpose, it soon went into the entire environment in the entire world, making our environment a hazardous place.
I was under the impression that it really came from what we call wet markets, where they're selling live animals and killing them to the people buying them.
That was the first idea, but then the truth usually comes out, and the truth is that within walking distance is the Wuhan virology lab, where this virus was created from an ordinary coronavirus, which causes the common cold.
In your chapter 3, you discuss a lot of animal connections to past pandemics, everything from poultry to water buffaloes, monkeys, ducks, cows. We have to be careful how we relate to other animals, don't we?
Oh, definitely. Animals are so mistreated. caged up, slaughtered, and treated in the worst way. Definitely we have to be more humane about our treatment of animals and try to follow a vegetarian diet at least a few days a week, which is what I've done. My co-author, Dan, is a complete vegetarian, and he wrote that chapter, but he did also point out the way this coronavirus was engineered and the different links that show that the virus was tampered with.
It's interesting that you're coming from different backgrounds, you as an artist and one who has dealt with health issues that you've written about, and Dan Marquez, who has degrees in chemistry, math, physics, and has worked with satellites, medical devices, space shuttle, and has other elements of science to incorporate in how we should be tackling these problems. And as you said, he's a recent vegan and supporter of animal welfare causes, as you are too.
Yes, Dan Marquez wrote 100 pages, and he thought it was a book, and he liked my book, Keep Your Breath, very much. And so he called me and wanted to send his book to me to look over. And when I looked over, I really liked what he had to say about the virus.
While we hear on the news every day about precautions that we should take, social distancing, masks, you have chapters here discussing what factors one should look at in terms of symptoms, when one should get additional help. You go into detailed explanation about the virus itself and how it's composed from a non-scientific point of view, including that science, but you're talking about receptors and other information. What do we need to be more aware of that we are perhaps ignoring during this pandemic?
We're completely ignoring the fact that the internal protection is much more important than the mask, the hand washing, and the social distancing, the lockdowns, and the closure of businesses and museums and churches and all the things that make life worthwhile.
Certainly everyone should be aware of how to stay healthy, and that helps with all sorts of diseases, not just COVID-19, but tackling all the toxic pollution that's out there now in our environment. We have to be aware of it. But let's talk about the chapter that intrigues me, because I have a cat, and you do talk about coronaviruses and pets, but they don't seem to catch it from us.
Yes, pets seem to be not so vulnerable as we are to this virus, and I don't know exactly why that is.
You have detailed chapters listing all sorts of supplements, herbs, food that have different properties that we should be considering. It's impossible for us to list every single one of them. Are there any particular plants that are especially important, like the essential oils?
Yes, I can boil it down very easily for you and for your listeners. Eat lots of vegetables, fresh, organic vegetables, especially leafy greens, colorful vegetables.
You literally have pages and pages of everything from seeds to vegetables like cucumber and fennel and garlic and dill and ginger and grapes, guava, teas. The list goes on and on. Leeks, legumes. Seems like about every kind of food that's out there we should be eating.
Now, the way I found out about it is I had parasites in my home for many years. They do get in the body and reproduce the same way the virus does. So the virus is actually a parasite. They created a parasitical virus, which is not like the measles or the mumps or the flu. The thing that you really need is three things: quercetin or quercetin, quinine, and zinc. Those three things are really what you need right now to kill the virus, because you need something that will kill a parasite. That's how I discovered quinine.
You also have a chapter dealing with other kinds of areas that we need to improve on, such as changing building codes to have the buildings have better internal airflow and to have public facilities with more strategic airflow, to have our transportation to be better with airflow. It seems as though we've built our buildings without considering that we have to have good airflow.
Yes, you need ventilation to get viruses back out. And that's why people who congregate indoors often get this virus from each other.
You have many pages of recipes. Do you want to share one with us?
Well, those are Dan's recipes, but basically if you eat greens and beans instead of meat and rice and lots of fruits. I do have recipes for my smoothie that I make every morning.
What's that made out of?
So the base is 2 large carrots, 1 orange, and 1 banana. And then you add any fruits and vegetables that you would like, such as mangoes, pears, apples, pineapple. Avocado is very good because it makes it smooth. Then you put ginger and you put walnuts and maybe mint if you like it.
I'm hoping you make home deliveries. It sounds great.
And then you fill the blender with a little over half of lemon water, plant-based milk, or I like Italian soda, which is actually just really good fruit from Italy mixed with seltzer water.
You have gathered and shared much information about this pandemic, about this virus, but I only found one quote by the famous philosopher Plutarch, who was alive in 46 to 120. He said, "An imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics." And you're saying this is proven again and again in history.
Well, the problem with this pandemic is it's made the poor even poorer and the wealthy even wealthier. So the divide has been even exaggerated.
With radio, we can't see your beautiful artwork. Can you just describe for us some of the eco-series where you mirror climate change with such titles of a large painting called CO2, or another one called Smog, or another one called Earthslide, about seismic shift?
Yeah, I went through a whole period where I did paintings based on the climate and the disaster that we're heading to if we keep going with the fossil fuels and the earthquakes and the warming of the planet. And we're seeing more forest fires. We're seeing more polluted ocean. Is pretty tragic. So as an artist, I did begin a series of paintings and drawings that reflected my concerns and the drama of what's happening around us, because the artist is like an antenna that receives messages and then goes ahead and creates something new with the messages.
You have provided lots of messages in your books, and your most recent one, COVID-19, A Natural Approach. The pandemic is of concern throughout the world. Many nations, many scientists all over the world are looking at what is happening, what has happened, what we need to do. How did you decide what information to share and what information not to share?
Oh, I would say to really investigate the natural approach.
You talk about how important it is to keep a healthy environment, from hand washing to cleaning carpets and floors to scrubbing ourselves and our environment, mopping, wiping. That helps with all conditions, doesn't it?
Yes, the virus can live several hours in the air and on surfaces. So if it gets in your home, you've got to get rid of it. And that means a lot of cleaning.
And you also talk about exercise.
If you build your immune system up with exercise, there's a better chance of getting well from any disease or preventing any disease, because your immune system is going to be a lot stronger. Your bones are going to be stronger if you lift weights, and if you do aerobic type exercise like walking or dancing or running.
I hope that we all stay healthy and take what is necessary to get us better. I want to thank you very much for keeping us informed about new areas of concern and what we might do to help keep ourselves safe and healthy. Thank you for being my guest.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, and be sure and take some zinc.
Thank you very much. I have been speaking with Susan Moss, who is an artist and author. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.